Thank you. Okay, welcome to episode 2 of the Anoikis Connection. My name is Tiberius. I am joined by newcomer Ashley Traynor from Foxholers. Can you say hi for us, Ashley?
Hello.
Returning is Laura Secco Cross from Hard Knocks.
Hello.
Also have newcomer Talon Shiruda from Wormhole Society.
How's it going?
And Captator returns again from Dead Terrorists.
Hey.
So, with the end of the month wrapping up, we have seen kind of a continuation of what we've been seeing, I would say, since February, where we've kind of, in terms of numbers, we've seen kind of like a continuation of a drop in terms of active PvP outside of evictions. Has that been the case for you guys in terms of gameplay? Do you feel that that's true or not true? What do you guys think? Talon,
Should I start, or?
Yeah, I guess we'll start with you, Laura.
I've not really been in wormhole space recently, besides evictions, simply because the day-to-day isn't particularly fun for me anymore. Because I'm going to harp back onto surgical strike here, which is like a buzzword for me. Anyone who talks to me knows that. So I don't shut up about how much that sucks for our playstyle. We don't have the apex armables to look forward to anymore. So I'm personally less motivated to scan and find content, and I know a lot of our other guys are. And then there's rolling changes that I know we're going to get onto later, which it makes time to content just a larger amount of time, a longer time period, and then the payoff for that is not as good as it used to be. So I found myself gravitating towards other ways to entertain myself that don't involve wormhole space recently.
You've been out and doing stuff in Nullsec, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And what is, for those who weren't here on episode 1, can you kind of briefly tell me what Surgical Strike is and how it differentiates between the February From Wormhole with Love patch?
The main impact that Surgical Strike had on wormhole space was the 20% resist nerf across the board to all armor and shield resistance modules, which it makes any ship that fits a lot of bling or fits a large number of tank mods a lot weaker, which means that bling wormhole doctrines that are designed to be able to punch up or designed to be able to sort of fight at peak performance, those ships are no longer anywhere near as effective. And instead of a sort of strategic attrition kind of fight that we used to have in wormhole space, we're resorted to nullsec style, just fast switching competition. Whoever has the most people tends to win. And as a result of how the maths works out, usually the side with the most numbers tends to get... the side with the least numbers tends to get less kills than they used to, just because they're bleeding people faster. Yeah. It makes fighting outnumbered a lot more difficult.
Ashley, what do you... Ashley and Talon, this is... do you guys have any counterpoints to that? Do you guys feel like that's true in your regards? Because obviously Laura Secco lives in high class. You guys live in a 4. Ashley, I believe you guys still live in a 2-3-2, is that correct?
Got a 4 with 2 and 3 static.
Okay, I'm sorry. 4-2-3.
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. I pretty much agree with everything Laura said. Wormhole Society is a fairly large alliance for wormholes, and while Surgical Strike definitely was a negative effect for wormhole space writ large, it hurt the higher end alliances and corporations a lot more than it hurt C4 corps like us, because typically our doctrines tend to not be as expensive. That said, a lot of people we would previously get good armor balls out of, we're just not seeing it as much. The day-to-day content as far as like hunting the chain and ganking some ratters or popping out into nullsec or lowsec, yeah, that's still there, but those fights that really get the shakes going and that you remember and make videos about, like, we just haven't had as many.
Okay. Ashley, what about you?
Yeah, for us, I've found it's not been too bad, and I think that just comes down to the size of your group. So for us, if we're in a brawl, we tend to field about 15 to 20 people, as opposed to, I'd imagine, Loro fielding 30, 40 plus. And it is just, once you're at that 30-40 mark, you're starting to look at DPS really just ploughing through, the Pism C-type resists now, which are the same as T2 resists 4 or 5 months ago. So it's a good point, and it is correct. But for myself, I found it's not really affected us so much. We're still getting the brawls, at least in low class space, in that kind of sub 20 man either side scale.
I would agree with the fact that, or the idea that the larger scale brawls, much more difficult, right? Because if you look like a Drake Navy issue, you get almost 1,000 DPS out of it. Once you surpass a certain number, if you just do the math with, how long it takes you to recognize you're getting DPS, broadcast, lodge you to see the broadcast, lock you up, get reps on you, et cetera, et cetera. Like once you pass that certain number, because of the damage buff from Surgical Strike and the resist nerf, ships are just going to die regardless of what you do, and it becomes a race.
Captator, you live in a 3 with a null-sec static. Would you say that since Surgical Strike, or even from Wormholes with Loved, have you seen a significant decrease in your being rolled into from other wormholers or anything of the sort?
So in terms of connectivity, our Pathfinder has never looked more like an octopus than since the Wormholes with Love. We're probably one of the only classes that, at least in terms of the connectivity changes, were being unaffected by the rolling changes, because our static was already a fair pain in the arse to roll. We've only benefited, and I think we're one of the few classes that could be said to be true. Okay. We don't see much activity. We don't tend to see people in the 3 at all. In fact, about half the time we have connected to another group, it's been another null-set group through the static null rather than through wormhole space. But the Surgical Strike stuff has definitely affected us out in null, because obviously we're almost constantly fighting in other groups' home territory, and so we are almost always numerically disadvantaged. And it turns out that being numerically disadvantaged against Munins is pretty rough when you can't tank them very well.
Right, because Munins are specifically designed to do Alpha Strike, and the less tank that you have, the less Alpha Strike it requires in order for you to get through.
Yeah, exactly. I could rant at length about Munins specifically, but I think generally losing resistances without a commensurate increase in buffer strictly advantages Alpha Doctrines against DPS Doctrines.
So I'm going to pull up a graph for our viewers here. This is the ISK fielded versus ISK sync graph. This has been, for all of the viewers here, this graph has been normalized for evictions. So what that means essentially is that I have painstakingly gone through 18 months of data and have removed eviction kills during an eviction. And that's important because the evictions are typically not considered to be quote-unquote organic in terms of the wormhole ecosystem. And essentially it means it's like if you roll into somebody or you scan into somebody or something of the sort. Evictions are usually long planned out, they're targeted, they require a lot of resources on and off, and evictions are not necessarily a good way of judging how the wormhole ecosystem is currently going. So I know that you guys have seen this graph. What have you guys devolved from this data? Is there anything in particular that stands out to you other than the February from Wormholes with Love patch?
I think the small spike in July. The small spike in July is new to me because I only saw this updated graph today. The one I've seen recently just showed June. I think this. If I had to guess, and this is obviously pure speculation because I have no idea what's actually caused this, but if I had to guess, I would say because recent changes have made PvE a lot safer, it's probably led to just more people being out PvEing potentially. I'd love to see the PvE data alongside this, which obviously only CCP could provide.
Yeah.
Just the MER stuff. commodities are sort of a separate thing.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I really wish that CCP would add back into their MER. They no long, CCP used to add blue loot as a separate commodity that they would show, and it would be a good way to kind of judge on how much ratting is being done in wormhole space. Obviously it doesn't show all of it because not everybody sells their blue loot immediately. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to pull blue loot data since I believe earlier this year was the last time they put it out. I think January of this year.
Unfortunate, but even the fact that it's more or less stayed constant while we're still under quarantine, for me, honestly, this sort of, if you were to show me this sort of drop in wormhole activity under normal circumstances, I'd shrug my shoulders. Just activity ebbs and flows in wormhole space all the time, the same as it does everywhere else in EVE. But the fact that this is happening during the coronavirus quarantine, that's what has me particularly concerned, because everywhere else the numbers are going up. So, or at least they peaked when the quarantine was at its peak and coming down. Now people are slowly coming out of quarantine. But this, if I showed you this graph without the dates on it, you wouldn't be able to tell me when the quarantine was.
Right.
Which is, compare it to any other graph from basically any other video game or even other aspects of EVE, it seems a little bit insane that activity's going down or staying more or less constant.
Does anybody else have anything they want to add to it? What I also found a little interesting with this is that if you've noticed ever since February going into, with a small area here in April, it seems to me that the margin for the ISK sink versus the tonnage lost has been significantly lowered. And for those of you watching, the ISK, the tonnage lost, it basically means the total value of a kill mail. So if you have an 800 million ISK Leshak, it goes 800 mil goes to the pile. The ISK sink essentially means like everything that was lost. So to me, and I could be off base here, but to me it seems that since that gap has narrowed pretty significantly, it almost seems that it kind of is like an indicator of risk aversion.
Is that not an indication that basically ships are being fit more cheaply?
No, I agree with Captator. I think that's exactly what it is.
It is.
Because you're the bits of the ship that can drop and therefore not to be sunk are your mods, right?
Right.
So if the gap is shrinking, that would mean more of what's lost is hulls rather than fit, which I think would make sense given how much smaller the value you gain from spending more on better, like complex platings or faction plate. Well, faction plates are still fine, but yeah, faction and Dead Space resist mods particularly, which I would imagine Wormhole Space was an abundant consumer of. Those are a lot less valuable now.
It makes PvP. It makes making money through PvPing more difficult, which is a very niche thing. Most people in Wormhole Space PvE using anomalies, but the few people who used to fund their accounts by collecting loot from their PvP kills, which there was at least one person in my corp who did that solely off PvP kills. It's a playstyle that we all kind of aspire to. I'd love to be able to fund everything purely through PvP, and fitting cheaper just means less is dropping, which kind of sucks. I want to draw a parallel. I think I mentioned this game last time, but I'm going to mention it again. I want to draw a parallel to Albion Online, which is a very similar, for people who don't know, it's a very similar open world full loot PvP MMO. It's about as hardcore as EVE is, except it's a fantasy MMO, so you're wearing gear instead of flying around spaceships. So when somebody dies, all the gear has, like, the loot fairy exists in that game as well, but there's not a base value of a ship that's destroyed, just all of the gear either drops or it doesn't drop. So the profit you can make from PvPing is much higher because there's a lot more dropping in loot, and as a result of that, it's a solo or small group PvPer's dream, that game, because you can fund your accounts purely off PvP. It's a direction that I really wish that we could see EVE go towards, but when people start fitting cheaper and the majority of the ship's value is in the hull itself, it makes that a lot more difficult. I will say, I'm looking at this graph and I'm confused why the gap is shortened in so early in the year. bearing in mind that Surgical Strike, which is the patch where we can probably all agree that people started fitting their ships cheaper, that was mid-April. I think it was April the 15th.
It was February, I thought, right?
February was
Or no,
from
sorry,
Wormholes
that's
with
from
Love,
Wolves Above,
which,
yeah.
for the record, this drastic drop in February is because CCP made a mistake with wormhole spawns and made them way too frequent, and that mistake has now been fixed. Which I'd say the drop in February is kind of invalid for discussion here, just because that was due to a bug that was corrected pretty quickly. But I am curious why it narrowed so early.
You put March down as perhaps just chance, and April, which is where Surgical Strike hit, as being that real point. I mean, it's
Yeah,
a good
true.
point.
March may well have been because of the war, because I assume like Tiberius removed all the evictions, but he probably didn't remove a lot of the skirmishes, and we were all generally flying fairly cheaply fitted ships. Like even our Lokis were mostly T2 fitted,
Yeah,
so
it's a
that
good
might
point.
have been why.
Well,
That might have been why we see that in
would
March.
would you say that in February, due to the From Wormholes with Love patch, that high class activity took more of a hit than low class? Because if you
Yes,
postulate
absolutely.
that, then it would make sense, because on average, high class ships are more expensive.
So in February, yes, because I simply didn't PvE in February as a C6 owner because CCP had increased the C6 connectivity way more than what was healthy for the game.
Right, but even after
And
they
then-
fixed that, though,
and
like,
I
rage rolling was still completely destroyed, right?
It was, yeah, but it still shouldn't affect the amount of bling loot dropped. But I think I'm not really sure.
So one thing that you have to account for, I think, with this is that a variable that you can't count for in this equation is that the loot drop is completely random, right? You know, it's completely random. You may have had tables that show, you know, that everybody in wormholes were dropping all kinds of stuff, you know, during at one point, and then you have another group it's just, you know, really dry where you're not dropping a lot of modules. So maybe that would be a reason why. All right, so kind of coming to a close with an update here. CCP put out the dreaded collective, which was, you know, to some people was kind of a bit of a too little too late kind of response. Essentially what that did was add some mass to some ships, or to some Triglavian ships, particularly the Leshak and I believe the Drekavac as well, and the Kikimora. What are you guys' thoughts on that and how it affects wormholes currently? Do you guys think that maybe it was a little too late, or is it a kind of a breath of fresh air? You know, maybe CCP is actually kind of paying attention to the mass economics of wormholes, which isn't really something that people, you know, think about sometimes.
Before we get into it, Tib, is there any way you can show on stream who's talking? Like have a little Discord overlay thing? Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm trying to I'm trying to get that fixed at the current second here.
While you are, sorry, I cut off Ashley there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, regarding the whole changing mass as a balance point, I think it's fantastic because it means that they don't just have to reduce the base velocity of every ship, they can change the agility and the speed that ships are kiting at simply by changing the mass, while also fixing problems like the Leshak being stupidly light for a battleship. Almost 40 million megatons less than every other battleship. It's crazy. But on top of that, you've also got things like the Drekavac, which the mass nerf stops it from being able to warp in 5 seconds, which is bad for me, but great in general. But overall, it is a bit too little too late. I think, you know, there's more that should be done, but it does make sense to start incrementally. I just hope they don't whack them really hard with the nerf back down the line.
Just CCP don't know what the word incrementally means with some of these balance patches, which is what has me concerned. Some of the buffs were quite good. The Zenitra buff, was it a 50% bonus or 150% bonus? I can't remember.
150% bonus, which is I think 2.5 times.
I think like if the heavy armor meta was still a thing, I would be kind of mad about that, because that's in the territory of killing our Apex armor brawls with sort of the strength of a dreadnought that has that amount of DPS with one turret, which means that a wrecking blow from that turret can make or break a fight, which is kind of stupid. Heavy armor fights being decided by randomness, but then heavy armor's been completely gutted by CCB anyway, so there's not really any point complaining about something that could have potentially killed it when it's just dead already. I think it's worth pointing out that I believe the Drekavac and the Leshak's speeds were also buffed along with the mass nerf, but the Kikimora just got the mass increase, which makes me think that the Drek and the Shak's mass increase was purely from a wormhole standpoint, was purely a sort of a wormhole mass economy thing.
And align
The-
time.
Yeah, the Leshak was had its velocity increase, but the Drekavac did not.
If it was just an align time thing, did the Drekavac not have its velocity increased?
No, the
Okay,
Drek's
I
dropped
would've
by
known.
it's about 1 to 200 meters per second with 50 mm.
That's
It's
fairly
dropped by.
significant. Okay. The Leshak, I think it's safe to say that the Leshak was a wormhole change, but you're probably right about the Drekavac, especially the drone bay nerf as well. It was a very strong ship in solo and small group brawling, and it definitely didn't need the utility of extra agility in the drone bay, so that's fine. A lot of people were complaining about the Draugr buff. Personally, I don't hate it, especially because it doesn't fill the same role as the Kikimora, because the Kikimora has a lot more damage. It's made it very strong in Nanogang in the hands of skilled pilots, but it just wasn't seen in use anywhere else, and this is going to give it a little bit more use there. What do we think of the essentially just like the mass increase to the Kikimora and then nothing else, no further nerfs?
I could be wrong, but from the way I understood it, the primary problem with the Kikimora was the application, and it's definitely used more in nullsec. I feel they're probably more better suited to talk about it, but like I even saw Pando say that they were surprised to only see a mass nerf on the Kiki and not an application nerf. That's what everybody was expecting.
It is a very strange choice to make. It's quite a significant nerf to an Anogang Kiki. It brings it down sort of 400 meters a second, almost, with 5 MN. And nullsec mostly seem to use 1 MN, so I'm not sure that they're going to be particularly bothered. But the Kiki's problem has always been that the very high tracking value that Triglavian guns have to make them work at close range doesn't work at long range because of how the application formula doesn't have any range dependent signature impact. So basically, as you get further away until you're out of optimal, your hit chance just goes up and up and up and up and up and up and up. Yeah, I had hoped that if they were going to look at the mass economy of the Leshak, they might use that as an opportunity to look at the masses of all battleships more generally, but I can accept that a reasonable interim solution was to just bump the Leshak up a bit so it wasn't so obviously the only real choice in so many contexts. Though heavy armor being one of the most significant of those contexts, no longer existing as Larissa is a little moot.
On that note, what in terms of, because Leshaks are used in roaching or ratting fleets pretty significantly. And a lot of you guys have static 5s here. Loro, I know that you dread rat. What do you guys? Has the mass changed affected ratting in a significant way? Is it for groups, or is that again kind of just one of those too little too late, not really gonna do very much for people kind of deal?
I would say not at all, because if you're ratting with Leshaks, it's not the kind of thing where you're going to be taking 6 nesters and 20 Leshaks through a hole, and even then you could probably still do it. But it's no, for ratting it's not made a difference at all. It's more to do with if you're trying to send, again, like a fleet of 30 to 40 people through a hole, that jump from 63 mil to 78 mil of mass is a relatively significant amount.
Definitely was aimed at PvP, yeah. I don't think anybody has much of a problem with Leshaks being used in PvE. I don't think static farming really needs a nerf as much as I hate people stealing my sites. I don't think it really needs a nerf. It made choices less interesting going into fights, because why bring Well, the Dracovac was more of an obvious sort of choice ruiner, because if you're looking at bringing sort of heavier stuff like battle cruisers into a fight, why even think about any other choices when you can bring 60% more Dracovacs because it has so much lower mass, or 40% more, or whatever the number is. Bringing the mass up, it's definitely a PvP thing. As far as what Cap was saying about the increase in Lashak mass goes, I think I'm pretty confident that it was a wormhole focus change, and if that's the case, then the increase was not enough, and the only way that this such a small increase would make sense is if something's happening to battleships in the near future that brings them a little bit closer in line with the Lashak, which is my hope. So I do think this is it's an early sign that CCP are watching mass, and I'm optimistic about this specific thing that we're going to see more of it in the future.
Tempest, please.
I definitely, if there's any CCP watching who are looking at battleship balance, please leave us something at around sort of the 97, 98 million kilograms mark to make rolling a little easier. Just like leave the Megathron or something around there, just to make our lives easier. Thank you.
The chunky ones at around 100.
On that note,
70, something around 40.
On that note, kind of to close this part of the discussion here, what are y'all's views as the summer kind of comes to a close here? Like, what's your expectations and kind of projections on what wormhole space is going to look like? Do you think CCP is going to have an updates? Are you guys optimistic about it? What? Give me your closing thoughts on moving forward for the rest of the year.
I don't like to predict what CCP are going to do in terms of updates and such, but for the last 3-4 months my corp has consistently been doing quite well in wormhole space with regards to just content generation, so I'm cautiously optimistic, especially just with our kind of fleet sizes.
How about you, Talon?
I'm really, really hesitant to to say anything, to be honest, because CCP's patches over the last year, I don't know. I think it really could go either way, and I think a lot of it kind of depends on if they come back and touch on high-class rolling nerfs. Because right now, I mean, there's a lot of low-class corps who are probably big enough and experienced enough to move to high-class, if we were like a year ago in that meta. But even all the people who live in high-class, they say, why would you move there? High class is just not doing very well, and I think a lot of that has to do with the rolling changes and the surgical strike changes. So I'm not really sure, to be honest. So just kind of waiting with bated breath.
Fair enough. How about you, Captator?
There are a lot of small and safe things that they could change. There are a lot of slightly larger and less safe things that they could change. I think the proof will be in the pudding. One of the things that I think has been a general sentiment among swathes across class in wormhole space is there is no clear understanding as to what CCP think wormhole space should be. There's a lot of understanding of what they used to think it should be, but reality has demonstrated that is not. That vision is not a reality, and so basically there's a lot of the kind of the reticence and the concern is about how will CCP reforge a vision of wormhole space that is consistent with how it is engaged with, and hopefully is supportive of that, while basically don't replace things, enhance them, I guess.
Alrighty. Okay, so we're gonna move into the kind of the meat of the subject. So today's episode, we're gonna talk about mostly about wormhole economics and PvE in general, and industry as well. Kind of touch base on that and see where everyone thinks on it. So, the opening question is do you guys think that wormhole PvE is in a good place?
Other than C4 sites, I would say generally yes. Well, C4 sites and the drifter. You can. I'll let you say something.
So let's touch base. Let's actually touch on C4 sites real quick, because that actually seems to be the bane of everyone's existence who has anything close to, or that interacts with C4s on a regular basis. Why are C4 sites so bad? Talon, I'll let you answer this question here.
Oh, thanks. As the one of the resident C4 experts, appreciate it. So the best way to understand why they're so bad is to just go run one. But the bottom line is there's two things. The biggest thing is the spawn ranges, right? You go into a C3 site, everything spawns within a reasonable distance for the most part, 50, 60, 70k. That's within drone range, that's within, faction rapid heavy range, a lot of stuff like that. If you go to a C4 site, you kill one wave, the other wave may spawn 100 kilometers plus from you. So one, the spawn locations are very bad. And then the jump in difficulty from C3 sites to C4 sites isn't really worth the increased ISK. Although, that may be kind of hard to see because of the spawn distances. So I would say the number one problem is that.
So C5s kind of have this same issue to a certain extent, but C5s can be easily fixed through bookmarks. Why can't you do this with a bookmark in a C4 site, for example?
So I don't totally agree with the fact that C5 is the same. I can sit with some Lashaks at the warp in. I don't even have to make a bookmark in a C5 site with some tracking computers and hit every single ship that spawns. I don't have to move at all. You can't do that in C4.
Is it just because of the way that the spawn happens?
Can I just as a sanity check ask, when you're doing the C4 sites and you get the long spawn, kind of generic CCP AI where it just shoots you from that 100 and whatever it is away, like quite happily. So you're not even getting like a downtime. So you could run like a buffer DPS fit rep up between waves as you approach and then go again.
Honestly, it's been a while, like a hot minute since I've run one. I'm not entirely sure on that.
When they spawn at range, they will typically boat in relatively slowly. They have a range they want to get to. Frigates want to be closer, obviously, and some of the battleships are quite happy to sit at about 60, 70, maybe 80.
It uses it uses the same orbit command as players do, Cap. So like the Wardens, for example, will right-click orbit 60.
But my question is specifically about whether they start shooting you from absurd distances away. Because like take a nullsec belt rat, like some of those will be shooting you quite fine at 200k, and it's like, okay, but what? So because if they have an engagement range, and they'll only shoot you inside that engagement range, it's quite a different setup that you have the option of running if they start far away than if they start far away, they're still shooting you, and then they want to come into a particular range. Like a lot of the AI design is that the range is kind of completely decoupled from what they shoot and how they shoot.
So
do you see what I'm asking?
I will hesitantly say that I ran all class in order for me to speak on this. I ran all types of classes of wormhole sites, and I remember very distinctly a couple of waves in the C4 sites where where they would spawn 140 kilometers away and be applying perfect DPS to my ship.
Yeah, so that's like, that's kind of the extra manure on the pile, as it were. The cherry on top of the cake.
Yeah. Now, isn't there? Aren't there? I believe I can't remember correctly, but I believe it's C1 or C2 sites that essentially do the same thing, where the waves will spawn, 70 or 80 kilometers away to some degree.
Yeah, there are a few, but 70 to 80 kilometers isn't too bad, because depending on where you're positioned and how fast they move, that could become 30, 40 kilometers relatively fast. And at that point, you're still well within range of something like a heavy missile Drake if you're just an alpha or something.
Do you guys think that wormhole PvE is scalable in terms of like risk versus reward? Um, I'll actually pass this over to Ashley real quick because Ashley, don't you run a site that is specifically talks about wormhole PvE quite frequently?
Y- yeah, so I run Ashy in dot space. I don't. It's not primarily a PvE site. It's generally more of kind of a fitting based blog. But one thing that's very popular on there is the how to crab wormhole guides, just for making ISK. I get a lot of hits to those. But yeah, just going back to scalability, you can do that, yeah. So starting with C1s, you could say use a 40 million ISK Gnosis. You could use something like a 70 to 90 million T1 battlecruiser in a C2. About 2 to 250 mil for a battleship in a C3. And it does step up from there. You skip C4s because they're trash. Go to about a billion for a C5 if you want to run them efficiently. And when I say efficiently, I'm talking kind of 3 to 500 mil an hour ish. And C6, you could do a C6 in about 1.5, 2 bill of ships relatively easily. But yeah, it does scale up, and I would say that the ISK that you get is worth it as you go up. There's a bit of a hiccup with C1s and 2s not being worth so much, and C4s being, as we've already discussed. But I like to think of C1s and 2s as the training zone anyway.
Do you think we need 2 entire classes as a training zone?
No, we don't. I think C2s could do with a little bit of a buff because it's pointless to do them for anyone who's got anything bigger than a battlecruiser.
So do you reckon C1s are in more or less a reasonable place and C2s could do with the bump?
And I think there are some difficulties with C1 sites. There are some that do a bit too much DPS for a Nubro. You've got the Phase Catalyst node, which does about 300 DPS, which for an alpha clone who wanders into a C1 site, that's a lot. But yeah, we could do with C2s just being perhaps bumped up a little bit in difficulty with ISK to match.
For those of you who don't know, the way that wormhole mechanics work is C1 through C3 are guaranteed to have a K-space connection as their static. So they're typically considered to be a training wheel zone to a certain extent for new people, C1, C2, C3s in terms of the sites. As Ashley was saying, C1s can be run relatively easily, and then C2s are not really worth it. And then C3s are where a lot of people make their money right now in terms of what they use. And, it usually goes from like cruiser, battle cruiser to battleship, the way that you can run them solo. So that's what they mean by training zones, is because it has a K-space connection. People are less likely to newer people are more likely to be in those particular wormholes.
Yeah, and you do find them, especially in these connections so close to Jita. You'll get people just wandering in with a battlecruiser just to have a crack at a site, because to a new bro, 20 mil is 20 mil, and if they can earn 100 mil per hour, that's a lot better than some of their level 2 or level 3 missions.
What would you... this is kind of an open question, anybody here. What would you guys recommend for new players to look into in order to get into PvE? Like, where would you have them start? Would it be C1s, C3s, or even C2s, even though they're quote-unquote trash?
I would tell them to look for a wormhole corp with a C3 static if they want to if they're starting right at the bottom and maybe only want to do 1 account or even 2 accounts. Find a corp with a C3 static. That seems to be a decent start because you can solo those sites and battleships, as Ashley said, and in some T3s as well. And honestly, C5 PvE is not a huge step up. So if there's nano gang pilots out there that want to get into wormhole PvE, a C2 nullsec corp with a C5 static is pretty good. You can run C5 sites with 2 battleships. They are quite expensive battleships, but the site can be done pretty easily. So there's some fairly good options with new players if they have the knowledge, and that's definitely the barrier for new players. So my advice would be to go find yourself a Wormhole Corp, or go find yourself somebody who knows how to Wormhole PvE, because the difficulty is definitely not the barrier, it's just knowing what modules to fit to your ship in order to complete the sites.
Number one most important module for a routing battleship, MJD. Don't forget.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
So the big thing is if you get rolled into, or if you just don't have enough characters to scout out the holes in the hole that you're routing in, when a dictator lands on you, you just MJD out and leave. Even in C5 sites, I mean, the way that Sleeper AI works right now, even if you have 6 battleships on grid, most of the time there's pretty much only 1 scrammed, and that's if there's scramming ships up, which a lot of the time there aren't.
A lot of the time they'll also tend to scram the sabers that are landing, and you tend to be able to get out quite quickly anyway. As I'm sure anybody who's been hunting in nullsec notices, half the time the rats in the Anom tend to switch to you when you tackle the VNI or whatever. Same sort of issues in wormhole space.
Talon, you guys have a 3 static as well. Do you guys are you guys a bit more lenient with new players coming in, trying to be part of the wormhole experience? And do you find that they have success out of the C3 static?
Yeah, I would definitely say the C3 static is one of the more used sources of income for our newer players. We help them out with strategies, whether it's practices or multiple remote rep dummies, teach them how to run sites. I mean, when I first joined Wormhole Society a while ago, I was multi-boxing a couple of dummies in the C3, and that was pretty good, easy ISK. So yeah, I would say yes. And that goes back to Laura Seco's recommendation of if you want to get into Wormhole PvE, find a good corp that has a C3 static.
Captator, you live inside of a C3 with a nullsec. How do you make your money? I would imagine home sites is probably out of the question, because home sites on C3s pay out very little.
Yeah, home sites is something that we tend to leave for the people who are kind of newest to the alliance and haven't got themselves set up with any of the other options, or as we sort of discussed, the newer players among us who don't necessarily have many other great options. We've got kind of we have high-sec ISK making concerns. We have people who go out into nullsec and do anomalies or complexes that they find out there. We had a little bit more industry going on, but since the moon mining changes, that actually a little bit before then, we kind of cut that off. Yeah, it's interesting trying to make ISK at the moment. There aren't a huge number of options that you don't have to commit a lot of hours to make any meaningful money. Wormhole high class is about one of the only ones left, unless you have a lot of capital, and then of course industry and the market are still strong options.
How do wormhole sites compare to, say, nullsec sites? So one of the big things that that draws people to nullsec is obviously the safety of local. Do you guys feel that do wormhole sites justify the risk versus reward in terms of the way that how things pay out?
I think there are you have to, if you want to have a good conversation about this topic, you have to be very explicit about separating the two kinds of risk, which are the risk from the PvE itself, and then the risk from the player interactions that you may get that you don't really want, i.e. being ganked or otherwise hunted.
Can you devolve on that a little bit?
So, wormhole PvE is more risky in terms of the NPCs are harder in that they do more damage, they have more nuke pressure, they have remote reps, but in some senses it is no more difficult than any other PvE in that it is effectively all solved and you just need to match numbers in terms of tank this much, have this much spare cap regen, etc. The significant difference in risk in wormhole PvE versus null PvE is, as you said, in the intel element and the ability to control the space around you such that you are either safe or you have the ability to make yourself safe with relatively little risk.
Drifters also do omni damage, right, as opposed to rat-specific damage. And they also tank omni damage, which means that they don't have any resist holes.
They have resist holes. Well, so there's a difference between sleepers and drifters, though.
Right.
So the sleepers, like, for all intents and purposes, like, while their resists aren't exactly the same, you can pretty much do whatever damage type you want to them. But for the drifter, there are some pretty significant resist differences.
What resist, like...
So, for example, in armor for the drifter, I believe, and I'm just doing off the top of my head, I believe it has a 50% thermal resist and a 0% EM. So, if you're shooting a drifter, having the ability to apply EM damage is very helpful. And thermal for shields.
That's right. It's just got the holes and everything else is patched.
So, according to Reiki's guide, it says their shield is 20%, everything else is 49%, and armor has an EM hole of 0%, and everything else is 50% resists.
Yep.
So that actually, if you're shooting into the holes on both sides, you're actually doubling the amount of EHP that the drifter boss is getting.
Yep, it can be pretty significant. It's to the point where sometimes it's better to use an damage bonus type ship. For example, if you're shooting the drifter with a ship that does, let's say, thermal bonus damage, it may even be better to shoot EM damage in armor.
Let's take a step back for a second. So what is could you explain again the difference between a drifter and the sleepers, and when does the drifter show up inside of like a site?
Sure, I can. I'll take it, and then Laura can tell me how wrong I am. But basically, NPCs in general in wormholes are sleepers, C1 through C6, and all the other classes as well. In high class, so C5 and C6 base, there are special types of NPCs called drifters. At the end of the site, after you kill a trigger on the last wave, this structure spawns, and when you aggress the structure by any means, this drifter spawns. It's very strong. It does, I believe, like 1500-ish DPS, newts a pretty hefty amount, and has 1 to 2 million EHP depending on what damage type you're shooting. You don't have to kill it. I would say it's much easier to just do the actual site themselves, as opposed to the drifter if you're in subcaps. So a lot of subcap fleets don't even attack the drifter. And the drifter does pay out more ISK than the entire site itself, at least in C5 space.
Yep. The drifters are worth 300 mil each, and just for clarification purposes, this particular NPC does not spawn except for in C5 and C6 wormhole, combat anomalies and signatures.
I think it's quite funny. The design of the drifter with the 1500 DPS and the newt strength, which I believe is minus 200 gigajoules a second, which is about the same as a Balgorn with talisman implants, I believe. It's definitely designed to kill the old pre-Citadel dreads. It makes me think that when CCP designed the drifter, they did so without the Citadel capital changes, because nowadays, with a dual cap battery fed dreadnought, a drifter just sort of... A Naglfar can easily beat a drifter.
It's trivial. Yeah, you can
without,
kill it.
Yeah. And yeah, the resist holds definitely very important, to the extent that if you're killing a drifter with a revelation, when you get to armor, you're better off shooting multi-frequency than you are conflag, because multi-frequency has slightly higher EM ratio.
So hold on a second. That kind of plays along the lines of what Captator was talking about, where CCP is, had an idea of what they wanted wormhole space to be like back in 2013 or so. Do you kind of feel like that kind of seems like to me you're, along the same lines there in terms of thinking?
I don't think CCP have ever known what they want wormhole space to be. I don't think they ever had a plan. I think the changes they made in 2016 were haphazard and incredibly poorly thought out, and nearly killed wormhole space overnight. The only reason we survived was because of the Citadel structures themselves dropping the barrier of entry into wormhole space into the gutter, which, like, under normal circumstances, I may well have said at the time that that was a bad thing, but it turned out to be the only thing that kept wormhole space limping along and then recovering after the horrendous PvE changes. To sum up why the PvE changes were so bad, well, we can rewind a little bit to late 2015. How people used to be able to run sites is you could siege one Moros in a site and just run the escalation wave, which I won't go into the mechanics of how we spawned it and how exactly we ran the sites, but it was about 3 billion ISK an hour, and all you needed was a perfectly skilled Moros pilot and a couple of characters that could sit in different caps to warp in and out to spawn the different waves. So it was incredibly powerful, and if somebody rolled into you, you'd drop a mobile depot, drop all of your Moros fittings into the depot, and you'd just lose essentially an unfitted dread with like the guns fitted that couldn't fit in the depot. A lot of people were complaining. They were fed up of rolling into systems and only getting a single dread kill, and they started complaining. And then Citadel came, and new wormhole changes were coming, and we saw on Sissy the leaks of new drifter bosses and anti-capital rats and all these exciting things, and we got excited. And then the patches hit Sissy, and then they hit TQ, and the new content didn't even need you to siege a dreadnought in the site. You could just run it in rattlesnakes. The drifter, it's generally ill-advised to kill it in subcaps nowadays because the AI was changed in February of this year. But back in 2016, when it was first implemented, it was pretty trivial to kill it with subcaps. And back then, sleepers didn't scram; they only pointed. So if somebody rolled in, you could MJD out and get your whole fleet to safety. So rage rollers, when looking for PvEers to gank, instead of finding the single boring Moros kill, they'd find nothing because they'd roll into a group of rattlesnakes and they'd all MJD out to safety. So I believe Region 28 activity, which is C5 space with C5 statics, I think it dropped by 60% in May of 2016, which is when Citadels were introduced. And it took, I think, 18 months to recover, if I remember the Z-kill stats correctly. So that change was just... At the time, CCP said that the intent of the change was to allow people to run sites more effectively in neighboring wormholes using battleships, and that was just a really bad reason. They just didn't give any thought and consideration to the consequences on the wormhole ecosystem. And I'm very worried because the one thing that we know for sure about the future of wormhole space is that CCP and the CSM have both said that there is potentially that there are at least plans for wormhole content coming out this year, wormhole changes. We have no idea what they are. We just know that something's coming this year, and I'm terrified that they're going to charge in head first and mess something up, especially with the changes that they've made recently. The change specifically aimed at wormholes, called From Wormholes with Love, was 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. Surgical Strike ruined way of life for a lot of people. It made the PvP shown in Clarion Call 3, which is the most popular EVE Online fan-made video besides Clear Skies. That PvP is now impossible because of Surgical Strike. Kicking over sandcastles, making evictions harder, but then as a counterpoint removing Choice of Day, which was necessary in nullsec but screwed over a lot of wormhole space defenders. There's just been change after change where wormhole space has been the unwilling collateral damage, and it gets really frustrating because a lot of times changes are specifically aimed at wormhole space, and people will say collateral damage, but like, what? These changes are aimed at us and they're just screwing us over. What are we collateral damage of? It just gets very frustrating.
You're referring to the potential possible changes that CCP have hinted at, but have no information on yet. Yet.
We have no idea what they're going to change, and I have no information to provide you on what they're going to change. Just that something's happening, and I'm very scared right now because nothing CCP has done in the last 12 months to wormhole space specifically has given me any indication that they have the right sort of idea about what needs to be done. There's been a couple of really good changes that they've made to wormhole space, but they've just been completely counteracted by the bad ones. So one of the ones they made that was really good was the drifter boss that Talon was talking about earlier. It can warp around, and it used to be able to warp around planets and around wormholes. And what people used to do is they would run the base site with subcaps, with rattlesnakes, and then MJD out and escape away from the drifter. And then when the drifter walked to a planet, they would bait the drifter within gun range of an Astra House, and you would PvP with the 16,000 DPS anti-capital fit Astra House and be completely risk-free. And it was an awful way of running and it also enabled a lot of botting in high class. There were a lot of C5 rattlesnake bot farms that don't really exist anymore because CCP made a change so the drifters no longer walk to planets. And they also FOF ratting, which is something that a lot of us have forgotten about. There used to be a very risk-free way of basically AFK farming C5 space that CCP have
FOF
removed.
Barguests was
Yeah,
a cancer way of running sites.
it's pretty awful. And then obviously adding scrams to sites was pretty good, albeit we've discussed earlier in the show why that wasn't a perfect solution. But it was still it still showed that they had the right sort of idea. But then they counteracted it with just some bad changes that just rolled back and made PvE safer all over again.
So to kind of touch base on, it's an important point you pointed out, I actually wanted to talk about as well, was back in February, one of the changes that CCP kind of did under the rug, but we all kind of knew was coming in the first place, was they got rid of, Astra House, the colloquial term that we, everybody who had lived in wormhole space for a long time was Astra House farming. They did exactly that with what Laura Secco said is, you run your subcap C5 farms inside of, whatever it is that you're doing with like 2, maybe 3 ships. They, bait the drifter boss onto their structure, and then they melt them with the anti-subcap guns. And I think once that happened, we saw an enormous departure of people in terms of people ratting inside of C5s when that happened as well.
Good.
Yep. So
as somebody you hunted in C5s, good. Yep. They weren't content for us in the first place. They shouldn't be in our ecosystem. Thanks. Great change.
And a kind of a personal touch, I don't know if this has been the case for all of you guys, but to me, if I remember correctly, it was mostly nullsec people. That it was a lot of nullsec entities that were doing that Astra House farming. Was that kind of the case for you guys? Did you guys notice that as well, or was that maybe just my own prejudice and bias that I'm looking at?
There were a decent number of nullsec cults, but I'd roll into more TD in C5s than anyone else in Region 27 with their 5-3s. So I wouldn't say that it was mostly nullsec, and I'm not even if it was, I wouldn't be particularly disappointed or upset about that, because it's just more people to farm in wormhole space. I wouldn't really be complaining too much. But no, I don't. I think it was just the nullsec dudes that were brave enough and committed enough to Eve to put the effort into setting up a wormhole and getting started. I don't think anything specifically about the Astra House farming brought in more nullsec than wormholers.
All right. Kind of talking a little bit more about some of the PvE changes that CCP did back in February. Do you guys think that the site scrams that they changed was, a step in the right direction?
I think it was definitely a step in the right direction. I don't think it was a large enough step.
Can you elaborate as to why?
Yeah, so basically, especially given the spike in the mineral index, since this is an economic episode, that spiked dread prices up a lot. It did make subcap ratting more risky, but I still believe that subcap ratting for the ISK you can earn per hour is not as risky as it should be relative to dread ratting.
Okay, so what we can I was actually going to touch a base on this a little bit later, but so like, can you what would be like the ISK per hour for subcap versus capital ratting?
Well, it entirely depends. I mean, I would say on the low end. I have never solo dread ratted. I've multi dread ratted. I've used subcap rats, but I would say on the low end, you're probably looking at a high triple-digit million, if not $1 billion per hour. If you got like 3 or 4 solid battleships, or a solo dread, and if you start putting multiple dreads on field, obviously that goes up to $3 billion an hour. But like the thing is if you have 6 battleships on grid, your crushing site's pretty good, and you get rolled into, even if a Saber lands on you in bubbles, a lot of the time you're still going to be able to MJD your entire fleet out and just go dock up at an Astra.
And then sacrifice the one ship that is being scrammed.
Yeah, I mean, assuming the scram didn't even switch to the attackers, but...
Right.
the general rule for site income I found is that dreads tend to make about double the ISK per hour per account than subcaps do. So when you're running, as Talon said, when you're running sites in battleships, you're looking at sort of 800 to 900 million ISK per hour per battleship, sort of with 3 or 4 on field, and then with dreadnoughts you're looking at up to 2 billion an hour solo. That's quite an optimistic number, but I'd say like 1.5 to 2 billion ISK an hour solo with a dreadnought. It's a very rough number, and there's a lot of examples where that's not the case. But it's a pretty basic metric that's usually correct. You're earning about double with a dreadnought, and of course you're limited by anom respawn. So that if you're a religious PvEer, then you're not actually making more ISK. It's just taking you less time to make the same amount of ISK if you're using dreadnoughts.
So let's say that's an important thing to note is that wormhole spawns in terms of combat do not spawn the same way that they do in nullsec currently, which is that they respawn very quickly and can be recycled and respawn as fast as, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but they respawn as they respawn faster the more that you run them, and that's not the way that it works with wormhole space. And CCP has never confirmed or denied this, but it's been through years of trial and error. The wormholers have kind of figured out that sites are region based, so you can kind of manipulate wormhole spawns based upon the region that you're in. So what some people will do is they'll seed an entire region of whatever type of class that it is. Like for example, one of the easier regions to do that in is region 27. TD Sin did this for a long time with region 27, where they seeded like 70 to 80 holes, and they had a bunch of Astra houses, obviously, whenever they were doing Astra house farming. And they would have someone essentially pre-warp the sites. And what that means is that they would warp to the site, and then how long does it take to despawn again? 48?
4 days.
4 days, okay. Sorry. And then they would cycle the sites. So
it was a good strategy, and it would be great if CCP stopped moving our scouts out of wormhole space and putting them in high sec. Please stop doing that, CCP. Thank you.
Right? Really?
Yeah, like
Stop
if you
doing
let an
what?
account go, if you let your scouts go alpha, CCP will move them to high sec, and it's incredibly frustrating. We're into the triple digits of scouts lost in wormhole space, being moved to high sec by CCP. It's incredibly annoying. Please stop doing that, CCP.
So
If you're in
if you have a, just to clarify,
So-
if you have an account that's Omega and goes Alpha in a Scout, and as a if you have an account that's seated in a hole that goes to Omega, it gets kicked out of wormhole space.
If it goes to alpha and it's left for a while, like a few months, then it will get moved to high sec. I don't know what the exact timeframes are. I just know we've lost a lot of scouts in a lot of systems that CCP have just blanket moved to high sec and haven't told us why or communicated with us about. Please stop doing that, CCP, if you're listening. It's incredibly annoying, and it wastes hours of work finding those wormholes and reseeding them.
Does it depend at all on what ship those seeds are in?
I don't know, because I'm not going to put the time into testing it.
'Cause,
It may
yeah,
it may well do, and I'm sure that it's some stupid rule about CCP helping new players, but I don't know. It's just very frustrating losing hours of hard work.
Has CCP ever made any kind of comment on this, public comment, or?
No, I think it's the first time we've talked about it publicly, just because, like, for me personally, I assumed it was something that they did for new players that they might think are lost in wormhole space, and they move them to high sec, so I just sort of didn't bother mentioning it. Frustration got the better of me there. I had to let that one out.
it's industrialization of alphas. It's not cool, bro. Like, never mind that they were Omega 3 seconds ago or a couple of months ago.
So
we can agree to disagree, but that's
Yeah,
that's
Yeah, but
it's another reason I've not pushed the subject too much. But at the end of the day, content creators are investing man hours into seeding wormholes, and we're losing said seeds to CCP, which is I hate anything that CCP does to make the life of a content creator harder, because they're already bleeding content creators out of this game.
But I think I'm basically memeing you, but I think the solid point behind what I said is that if there was a rule, like, okay, if you have an account that's like in a scout that's just left in a hole for 3 months, as an example number, and it's like if it's out for 3 months in a hole and you're not doing stuff with it, right, it's gone.
Yeah, that's
And then you'd at least have a rule that you can operate
that's
around.
fine. So please tell us that, CCP, instead. Like, we shouldn't be working these things out through trial and error. It's just not a mechanic that we should be having to work out for ourselves, especially because I assume it's just some script that somebody runs every few months.
It does seem like something to help new players, so...
It
maybe.
does, yeah, which is why I've not made a big fuss about it, but it'd be nice to actually hear something about it and not have to work these things out for ourselves.
Kind of maybe get a bit back on track here. So somebody said
Sorry.
that no, it's fine. It needs to be said. A lot of this stuff gets thrown under the bus and not really talked about sometimes. So I mean, it definitely needs to be said. Some of you guys were throwing out numbers like 3, 4. I've even heard sometimes 5 billion ESC per hour. Like, what are the skill requirements and time? Like, what are the skill requirements in order to do that, and the kind of like the time invested required to do that?
For more than 3 bill an hour, you're looking at, I would say, 3 or more T2 Siege Dreadnought pilots, specifically Nagelfarbs, being the best, because as we talked on earlier, the resist profile of the drifters with those resist holes, the Nagelfar being the only turret dread with selectable damage type makes it the superior for PvE, which is why they're the most popular dread in wormhole space nowadays. So, so 3 or more characters with T2 Siege and reasonably good support skills, probably sort of like Dreadnought level 4. I started with T1 guns. It's a little bit worse, but it is doable. So yeah, about that sort of level, we're looking at sort of 20 million skill point pilots if they're purely focused into Dreadnoughts.
Talon, you said that you've done a bit of dread riding. Would you say that that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, one of the bigger barriers to entry for capital routing in high class is, just the logistics behind it. You have to get the capitals seated in there, and then either live out of a POS or, preferably a Fortizar. But then if you're not buying a hole, you have to go anchor a Fortizar and hole control, or, just cross your fingers and pray. But as far as just character investment, yeah, I agree with Loro. But the time investment, and a lot of the behind-the-scenes logistics that aren't included in the ISK per hour, people never talk about that, right?
True,
in
yeah.
nullsec, you just undock your whatever the hell, you warp to an AOM, and you're going. You don't have to move ships into the hole. Well, you have to move ships to nullsec, so maybe that's a bad example, but yeah. The ISK per hour, and this is true for nullsec and wormholes, and it never includes this setup. So I would just caution people, who are thinking about getting into wormhole PvE, especially high class, don't forget about all the logistics that you're going to have to do to move into a farm hole and set that up.
So expand on the word setup a little bit there, because I feel like that maybe is a little bit extra stuff, that people are kind of missing.
Yeah,
well.
So it kind of just depends too on whether or not you want to do subcap or capital routing. If you want to do capital routing, unless you want to hobo dread with a solo dread around high class, you pretty much have to be living in the hole with the capitals that you're going to rat in. If you're subcap routing, sure, you can set up an Astra or Retaru or whatever in your high class hole with your ships, or you can just get a low class hole with a C5 static and go right out of your static. And with MJDs, that's not that risky, especially if you have some scouts. So I would say that for capital routing, there is a significant amount of logistics that typically goes into establishing and then maintaining your farm setup. Subcaps can be fairly low effort.
Okay.
There's quite a difference between the two, because if you're gonna get 3 dreads into the hole, you're building them. I guess you could do it. If you want to just buy them off the market, you've got to get the right connections. You've got to burn them there. You've got to maybe make a few jumps around K-space to get them to the hole, and then you've got to have the characters, the alts most likely, that are going to be logged off with those dreads most of the time. unless you want to be burning around with those characters every time you want to farm.
Yeah, if you're nervous about solo moving caps around, I'd stay away from high class PvE unless you're like an industrial person. But once the initial setup is out the way, the only real difference is with subcap riding, you don't have to haul in Stront. So the initial setup is obviously a pain, bringing in the Dreadnought hulls, getting the fits in, etc. But once you're set up and you've got your Fortizar down and your pos or whatever, the day-to-day maintenance is not that much more difficult. It's made more difficult if you die in a Dreadnought, because of course if you get walled into, there's no escape because you're in siege mode. But besides that, there's not a huge difference.
It's one of the only remaining capital coffins that exist, right? Effectively. I mean, not in absolute terms, in that obviously you can put them in a hangar or whatever, but
it's quite easy to drop them in a pos and pod the character out and scan it back in later. I do that a fair bit. Back when I didn't have enough dread pilots to PvE and PvP at the same time, I'd be burning characters around all over the place. So a coffin, it's definitely a commitment. It's not so much a coffin.
Fair enough.
On the topic of dreads, one of the other data points we're going to look at now is, back with From Wormholes with Love patch, we saw a pretty statistically significant drop in dread kills. If you give me just a second here, I'll pull this up for the audience. So this graph here that we're looking at, we're looking at all the way again from January of 2019 to July of 20. Obviously the Naglfar is by far the favorite dreadnought to use for ratting, and for reasons that we've discussed before. We saw there's a huge drop in February. There's a couple things that happened during From Wormholes with Love patch in February. First of all, we got more connectivity. And then they made unrollable frig holes, and then they also added they removed the ability for high class wormholes to be one shot with capital rolling. So for those of you who don't know what that means, essentially means is when there used to be an opportunity, or it used to be a mechanic in the game that allowed you to add more mass to a wormhole as you were jumping through it. So as you hit jump and the game was registering you to jump through a wormhole, you could activate your prop mod on a carrier, and it would add additional mass to the wormhole. You would come back and do the same thing, and then that's called one-shotting a wormhole. There's just so many layers to this graph in terms of what happened From Wormholes with Love. Like, what do you guys think is like the main cause of the drop in dreads? Is it that maybe the connectivity issues, or maybe there's just CCP removed the tools for hunters? What do you guys think?
I think I already touched earlier why the drop was so drastic in February, because CCP accidentally increased the connectivity in C6 space way more than they intended. And I think they knocked a 0 off the number or something ridiculous when they fixed that. So that was why there was such a steep drop in February. The numbers didn't recover in the 1 to 2 months after February, because in March there was a huge wormhole war that involved a lot of attacks on C5 and C6 dread farms. So a lot of people, if they were farming, they were doing so a lot more carefully than they were before. So that's the drop there. April, I honestly would kind of put down to people still kind of being burned out from the war. I know a lot of people from Hard Knocks were. And then we see a small recovery, but by the time May or June rolls around, Surgical Strike has come into full effect. Wormhole content's starting to slowly go down for anybody who puts more than 25, 30 people on field. And we're seeing the drop continue into July, which, to be fair, the difference between June and July is so small that it might just be down to 1 or 2 groups having less activity. So I wouldn't read too much into activity continuing to decline following July. But
so if you
it's certainly not going up to
if you compare it to
pre-war.
July of last year, there was a dip in July of last year, so I guess that's kind of to be expected to a certain degree.
Yeah, and wormholes quite. I believe I'm correct in saying that wormholes pretty much always slump in the summer. Albeit this year I expected it to be different because of the coronavirus. But the real test is going to be September, which is always a busy month in wormhole space. You can see it quite clearly on this graph. That's really the month that I'm sat nervously waiting for to see where activity goes, because that's when people start getting back from the summer holidays. It's when CCPs start getting back and looking at change and looking at potentially new changes. So that's the important month, I reckon.
Yeah, so August you'll see there's a huge spike. It returns back to normal of kind of last year in terms of average activity. It's a little bit higher than average for that whole I would say that whole 6 month time frame, but you'll see that August and September are pretty high in terms of activity because like you said, everybody is coming back from their summer holiday. We have a lot of Northern Hemisphere players. A lot of people go out during June and July to do their stuff and have fun with their family. So I'm anxiously waiting that as well because and hopefully CCP will put them out. Put those numbers out soon because I would like to be able to see where the health of that is and to see if it's actually gone up or not. All right. So, back when CCP did their ore changes in what month was that? Does anybody remember off the top of their head?
It was February, I think, late February.
Was it late February? Okay. So now that CCP has done their ore changes in February to nullsec, and a lot of speculations of the market have settled out, and there's the price of ore has leveled out as well. Wormhole ore sites are technically considered to be one of the most lucrative in the game, especially some of the high class wormhole site or the high class ore sites. Have you guys seen an increase in activity and any kind of mining in wormhole space at all because of it?
I think
Nope.
it suffers the same thing that the combat anomalies do, in that it's inconsistent. So if you want to put a mining operation into place, you want some kind of consistent guarantee of output, so you can then base an industrial process on that, and there is no consistency of that nature, so it's not worth.
So what about rolling for ore sites? Has that ever been, a thing to do for anybody of the sort, or is that kind of more of a meme?
Heard of anyone doing that? It'd be really strange because you'd need to roll around, make sure the hole is as secure, or scan out a lot to make sure PvP entities, and then sit there for a few hours. If you're not living it in home, it's a bit spooky.
I'm pretty sure it's both less profitable and less convenient than just running the anoms, assuming you're static farming.
Rolling for gas is definitely something that people do, but again, that's about time at risk and total time invested for return.
And the whole 20-minute ninja huffing.
Yeah.
So you're saying that you'll never see anybody specifically rolling for ore sites in wormhole space, do you think?
I don't know about anyone else. It's been at least a year since I last saw a rock wall in a ore anomaly. It doesn't really happen because the people who own the high class wormholes tend to be PvEers, and they don't tend to have the skills for walk mining. So when the nullsec nerfs came into play and ore anoms in wormhole space by extension became one of the more profitable ways of mining, the PvEers didn't all become miners overnight, I suppose. I certainly haven't even considered a rock wall because, as Cap said, it's just very inconsistent, the spawns. I'd rather just run the combat anomalies.
And also, you are sitting there for a long time to get any kind of payoff at I don't know, let's be generous and say like 150 mil an hour worth of mining, and then you also have the
Yeah,
significantly increased logistical hurdle of dealing with all of that, or compressed,
for sure.
or
Yeah.
building, and it's just like, yeah, I think there are too many hurdles for the people who are already kind of the mindset to be in wormhole space, and I think there are too many wormhole related hurdles for all of the people who are of that mindset outside wormhole space, if that makes sense.
That time is also all risk as well. When nullsec dudes come along and say that the wormhole PvE is too safe, they don't consider that we don't have an umbrella. If my ships are tackled in my C6, I just sit and die. There's nothing I can do to save them, particularly unless I have a small army of PvP ults also logged off in that hole babysitting them. So I don't mind fielding 2 or 3 dreads because it's high ISK per hour, and I just do it for an hour or two for however many times a month that I need to do it. With vocal mining, it's the sort of thing where you put it on in the background and then you go do your laundry or whatever in nullsec. That's just not practical in wormhole space, where you're just exposing yourself. You need to think about it of sort of ISK per risk rather than ISK per hour, and it's just not viable unless you're mass multiboxing vocals, which is not worth it at all in wormhole space because you tend to get so few anomalies.
Panic in wormhole space is useless because you don't have backup coming. Basically.
It is, unless you're mining in home, which
done that doesn't go very well either.
You know, well, that was one of the joys of vocal mining in home because the very nature of wormhole space means that it's super easy to bait someone into dropping a response fleet. Because they don't have intel, they don't have scouts in other people's staging systems or any of that rubbish. They don't know who's lurking 2 jumps around the corner. That was one of the beauties of wormhole space. It's what made Panic so incredible when it came to vocal mining in home sites. And I know very little about industrial mining, but I was definitely upset when ores were removed from wormhole moons because it just meant less vocals to kill in people's homes.
Yeah, wasn't there a group that had C2s and C1s that was just hundreds of moons with Athenors and Taytaras, and we're pulling every day, and you would see 12 to 15 oracles on scan at a time?
I don't know who you're talking about, but that would not surprise me. I've definitely seen wormholes of the sort where you enter and there's something like 40 Athenors on scan, and you certainly I know there's quite a few groups that have pulled their Athenors down. I don't know if any of you guys have, but
I certainly have. I pulled all mine down.
Yeah, and work wall changes aside, anybody that did live in a C1 to do that, C1 space pretty much got decimated by CCP.
Oh god, the rolling changes, yeah.
It takes about 30 battle cruiser jumps, like to roll a C1 will now.
I'm actually ashamed to admit this on stream, but somebody taught me into trying out PI the other day, and I went around thinking, okay, who do I know that owns a C1 high sec with decent PI? And I asked about 6 people, and none of them live in their C1s anymore. And I just couldn't find anyone, which I probably dodged a bullet in hindsight. But it just amazed me that there's literally nobody. I could not find someone.
Ashley, you mentioned that people roll for gas. What gas sites are those that people normally roll for?
Let me just check the list. I don't know off the top of my head because I'm not normally the one to do it. But it's
right?
Yeah, instrumental, bountiful, vast, anything just with a lot of ISK where you can take a number of ventures or prospects if you want, and half as much as you can within 20 minutes. And you do sometimes get people who go in with mining links and clear out the whole cloud instantly. And they'll just blitz all the sites, bring back a few 100 mil and move on.
And to jump in super quick, for any new bros listening, after 20 minutes sleepers will spawn, so don't go AFK in a gas site.
And don't warp to ordinaries.
There are sentry turrets.
Yeah, sentry turrets that'll insta-kill you.
I swear like 20% of wormhole kills per month are just ventures and ordinaries.
Hilarious.
That's just such a troll move by CC. They probably did it on purpose as well.
What are those? What is that gas used for? They're not used for boosters, right? The wormhole gas, the C3 gas, or the C type gas.
I think it's used for selling in Jita, right?
Yeah.
if you don't want to sell it in Jita, your other option is to react it, and then you can sell that, which is much easier to move out. Or you can take it further and use it to build T3 cruisers or destroyers.
Talon kind of makes a good point, though, as a bit of a meme. You know, T3 prices have been, I feel like decimated over the years. Do you guys feel like that the nerfs have any real significant, value to that, or add any real, the reason being behind it, or do you think that there's other factors that play with that?
Well-
Yeah, of course the game balance comes into play.
Yeah.
For the record, shout out to Extra Squishy, whose use of the Hikade and the popularization of it has single-handedly propped up the T3 component market. So thanks, man.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the market graphs over the last year, battleships are up 50%. I mean, granted, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison between T1 and T3s, but like the Legion prices are at almost a 52-week low, and I bet the other three would be fairly close as well.
And that's coming on the heels of the most recent T3C nerf, right? What did they nerf on the Legion?
God,
Was
what
the
a
power grid, I
terrible
believe?
change.
Yeah.
So the Loki got some well-deserved nerfs, frankly. It's in a place now where it's still usable, but nowhere near as strong as it used to be. The Legion already wasn't used that regularly. I think Hard Knocks may have been the only corp in one more space that was using Legions at the time of the nerf. So, yeah,
Right,
that one.
and a bit of Volta whaling with legions.
Oh yeah, of course. And then there were the 100 MN nanogang users who probably still use those fits and just throw in an extra power grid rig, but it just seemed like a very unnecessary nerf. And then
The sorry, just to chip in, the solo 100 MN Logi Legion got absolutely obliterated by that change.
oh yeah, but it wasn't.
You don't have the slots.
You can still do the Loki, right? You can shield tank it and stack PDSs.
Yeah, you can still do the Loki. It's significantly worse, but it's workable. The Legion is not workable.
The Loki got nerfed pretty significantly, and we're still in a position where it outperforms other T3s in almost every role. Like, it's better armor Logi than the Proteus and the Legion. It's better shield Logi than the Tengu. It just... I still can't think of a role that the Proteus does better than anything else besides Chemo, which is
That's it.
so niche. For those who don't know, Chemo's the what? Sorry.
Anti-tackle drone Proteus. It's amazing.
I'd rather
with
use a
nabs
Webati Loki. I can see like Ashley made a point before the show that T3s still hold their own when it comes to solo or small group cloaky cruiser PvP, which is definitely a valid point. I think my old solo rep New Legion fit still works, but it's it's about as niche as chemos are. In fact, I think chemos have seen more popular use recently thanks to the war. And for those who don't know, chemos are full smart bomb fit Proteuses, usually used for killing jackdaws and harpies and other small things.
Cloaky gangs themselves aren't in a brilliant place right now, so that's kind of like
No, they're not.
the lack of activity of T3C in that use case is emblematic of the use case itself not being very prominent.
To CCP's credit, as bad as the 2017 T3 balance was, the one thing it did do was bring us cloaky Logi, so those gangs do actually kind of work now. Like I know a couple of nullside groups have shield Stratios doctrines with Logi Lokis, which would have just been like when the Stratios first came out. I don't think anyone could have really imagined a proper Stratios doctrine in an nullside alliance.
Kind of touching base on the T3s and how balance affects the market value of these. Do you guys believe that T3s being in the position that they're in now, do you still believe that SP loss is a valid balance mechanic for these ships?
No.
Nope.
Nope.
Can you explain why?
Wow, that was pretty unanimously.
So now that skill injectors are a thing, you can pretty much look at SP loss as ISK loss. Obviously, the higher SP you are, the more ISK it is because of skill injector penalties. But when I think about SP loss, that's how I think about it. I just add a few hundred mil onto the cost of the ship. And I could either fly a command ship or a hack that doesn't have SP loss and is probably cheaper than the T3C.
And it's probably strictly better
Yeah,
if you
and
don't
it's
need to
probably
make
just
scrolls.
better, and I don't lose SP doing it. And for the hacks, I have an ADC.
I think most of the player base, including the T3 focus group, parroted that point again and again in the 2017 rebalance, and CCP didn't listen, and I don't think ever explained why. So, sad days, but
It's a
there we
unique
go.
mechanic. It's the unique anti-selling point.
It's a unique thing. Let's discourage people to fly this unique spaceship as a unique mechanic.
So someone.
I mean, like, so
Go
in
ahead.
fairness, back when T3C were absolute monsters, I can see why it was maybe a good idea. They were like, okay, we're going to leave this thing powerful, but we're going to give it like a strong penalty, so it's like an extra risk when you undock in one of these. That yes, okay, you get this power, but you're going to get a lot more penalty when you do die. But
It made sense before injectors.
it's a terrible idea now.
Yeah.
Even now, we've got so much SP, most of us, that it's like, oh no, I'm not training Repair Drones 5 for 3 days or something. It's
Yeah, oh man,
not-
I've got to put off training blobs for another 4 days. What an incredibly useful ship that I won't be able to fly for an extra 4 days.
But I mean, but even there, like that, even if you were, even if you had like more fundamental important skills, like that's actually it's poor design because you are penalizing a newer player more. Like, okay,
It
yes,
is, yeah, you're right.
they maybe pay less because they're lower down the SP curve on the injector penalties, but actually that time to them is more important in terms of expanding their gameplay. Whereas like when you're exactly as Ashley said, when you've got lots of SP, it's not really. It's an inconvenience, yes, but it's not like it doesn't substantially change your gameplay over the next few weeks. Whereas if you're lower down, it really could.
So
Do
somebody
you
in
think
chat.
CCP... Sorry, go ahead.
So somebody in chat said that SP loss is a dated mechanic. You know, some of you guys are kind of talking about the T3Cs of old. You know, SP loss, if I'm not mistaken, was a balanced choice before the T3Cs because of their, you know, incredible viability across the board. And when you lost it, you know, it was a pretty significant deal. Can anyone kind of expand and explain as to kind of like what T3Cs looked like, you know, back before the rebalance?
So you're getting the DPS of a battleship, the EHP of more than a battleship, the resist profile of a T2 cruiser, and the SIG of a battle cruiser, and the mobility of a battle cruiser all in one package. It was pretty strong. Like easily 1200 DPS, sort of 200 300k EHP Proteus with a cloak. Kind of like they were pretty nutty. I think one of the things that was an initial mistake perhaps was that there were so many subsystems. If you just look at the combinations that exist, like it's an unbalanceable problem because there are just too many combinations, and so the only way to approach the balance of that problem is, or approach balancing them given that problem, is to deliberately make only a few of the subsystem combinations viable, at which point there's no point in having all of the possible
hard point
combinations.
efficiency, Loki.
I don't... Yeah, okay. We said before the show that T3 balance was going to be a huge rabbit hole. I think a lot of... the skill point system in EVE is definitely probably... It's definitely the most legacy mechanic that EVE has kept to today, and a lot of the things to do with SP and gaining it and losing it are very dated and simply not particularly good mechanics. I think the entire EVE player base can agree in unison that remaps and attributes are a really terrible idea. And it's along these sort of lines where CCP can't quite shake this because there's one little nitpicking issue with removing them that they don't quite want to abandon.
I mean,
They don't want to lose the uniqueness of the system, which is probably a similar reason they want to keep T3 SP loss.
To be fair,
There was
attributes
a-
and remaps are better than learning skills.
They are, but they're worse than removing them completely
I agree.
and just implementing implants or boosters that give a percentage skill point gain bonus
So one of
for the
the
sake
one
of
of
the
the
LP stores.
one of the things I think it's important to note as maybe one of the older players in this conversation is that one of the old core selling points of EVE, not so much sure if this is present now, was that there is that existence on that kind of short-term versus long-term reward and so they wanted to create this or maintain a system where you could kind of prioritize immediate payoff, or you could prioritize long-term payoff. And that was kind of like the learning skills, and a lot of the stuff around attributes and SP, I think, stem from that point. So I think the difficulty in trying to propose like scrubbing all of that away is that you're losing one of these like underpinning tenets of how the game was thought about in Inception. And in fact, actually, there aren't that many places in the game, I think, relative to what there were, where there is that trade-off of long-term versus short-term, payoff.
If it's an interesting trade, then let's talk about it. But
well,
this is just not.
exactly. But it's
just
actually quite difficult to do an interesting trade. I think it's part of the problem there.
Here, it is quite difficult, especially when it talks about waiting just in-game days and weeks of not actually playing the game to gain the reward. There's no interesting payoff there, so just scrub it. CCP had no problem destroying that core principle by introducing injectors. I suppose removing remaps won't increase the size of their wallets as much as injectors did.
Yeah, there's definitely not the same business case.
Yeah, absolutely not. I just, in my opinion, the core principle that you're talking about, I see the logic behind it, but injectors did kind of. I think injectors kind of gave a middle finger to that as well, which I'm not necessarily against that, but I don't think the logic stands now that injectors are in game.
I think that one of the other things kind of that is very interrelated, but actually in some ways is also completely separate, is this the necessity of recognizing that you have effectively a very old and entrenched player base that start so much further ahead that they aren't having to make those decisions anymore, and you're comparing that to you're trying to level the playing field for all of these newer players that you're trying to bring into the game to both grow it and kind of like keep that enthusiasm and breath of life that we all know sort of newer players tend to bring in more than bitter old players like myself. And so they're torn between the two tensions of, well, okay, which we tried to create a system that has this tension between immediate and delayed gratification versus, you know, how big that payout is, and now we also have to deal with this reality that the game has been going a long time, and we have a lot of people who are so far up that curve that they're just in a completely different place compared to all of these people that are just trying to join. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you guys have got a lot to say about T3s. I guess maybe we could do a whole episode on T3s to a large extent. They have a really large history in wormhole space. They've been around for 11 years now. I remember back when you could get, or if you wanted to get into a Tengu, you had like a 3 to 4 billion ISK investment. Now it's a fraction of that cost.
It's also a fraction of that power, of course.
Yeah, of course. All right, so we're coming up on time here. We're gonna try to get some closing statements from you guys. So the final thought here is, if you guys were to make one change to Wormhole PvE, what would it be and why? Ashley, I'll start with you.
As much as I want C4 sites to be fixed, I think I would probably like C5 and 6 escalations to be reworked into something that isn't just a DPS grind. It's no better than mining, killing a drifter.
Fair enough. Talon, how about you?
I would take some of the blue loot from high-class subcap rats and move them into the Avengers, which are the rats that spawn when you warp capitals, minus the work wall, for some reason, onto grid. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because I know that has actually been passed around the community a little bit, and has received quite a bit of praise. Kind of, first of all, what is the Avenger on a site? Yep. Real quick. So so for C5 and C6 base, if you warp a Dreadnought carrier or fax on grid with an ANOM, it spawns either 3 or 4 Avengers, depending if you're C5 or C6 respectively. And these are basically just capital killing NPCs. They nude a lot, they do a lot of DPS, they have a lot of EHP. It takes a little bit to kill them with dreads. And they can mess up subcaps on grid pretty bad, which is why you typically don't see like subcaps and dreads on grid together. because it's very difficult to tank Avengers and subcaps. So that's what Avengers are. So I said earlier in the show that I think the risk-reward balance between subcap versus capital riding is still skewed basically too little risk for the reward for subcaps, and I think that needs to be shifted more to capitals. And one way of doing that would be by maintaining the same ISK per hour for capital riding, but reducing it for subcap by moving some of that blue loot from the subcaps into the Avengers that only spawn when you have caps on grid.
Yeah.
And having more caps on grid would hopefully like create more wormhole content. Like if you look at that graph from earlier, we're just not losing as many dreads, and dread fights and sites can be pretty fun content. So.
Just for some context there, the old escalations you used to fight Sleepless Guardians, which would drop all the blue loot. Nowadays all that ISK is in the Drifter, and the Avengers which spawn drop something like 20 mil. It's really not worth it.
Alrighty. Well, that sounds like a pretty decent change. Laura Secco, how about you?
Do the rolling changes count as PvE?
I feel like it kind of does, because it kind of, it adds to the risk versus reward factor. We can...
Yeah, it makes PvE more risky if...
Right.
To CCP who are listening, I'm aware you implemented the changes because it was fixing a bug, but you have several solutions that can make wormholes good for us again that don't involve reverting the change. You can just increase the maximum jump mass on high-class wormholes up to 1.85, and then add an exception to prevent super capitals and titans from jumping.
And C1.
Yeah, and then the poor C1 guys, you can up the mass on C1 wormholes to just under a Lashak. Lashak's 78 now, right? So you could up C1 maximum jump mass to 75 mil to make rolling them a lot easier. And you still wouldn't be able to jump in any battleships besides a Nesta, so it wouldn't change any gameplay particularly.
Yep. And we could look back at those numbers again, regardless of what you think may or may not be the cause, in February we had three main changes that happened. We had the rolling changes, we had the that prevented you from one-shotting hulls, you had the increased connectivity that was patched out, and then, you had the frigate hull spawns. So, the increased connectivity obviously was patched out to a certain extent, and frigate hulls only spawn so often. You can easily kind of come to the same conclusion that, maybe the reason why the dreads aren't dying as much is because of rolling changes. So I definitely think that rolling changes can be lumped into PvE, because, like you said, it definitely makes it much more risky.
Oh, there's my PvE change then.
All right, and finally we've got Captator here.
So I guess I struggle to come up with a succinct change, but I'm not of the opinion that farmhole meta is particularly good for content or for the general ability for groups to enter wormhole space and feel like they can carve out a small niche, particularly in high class, without rubbing up against the titans, I guess. I just don't think there's a way of summarizing how you might change that, and whether there are, what the pros and cons are. I don't think removing anything that exists is a good idea, but I think offering preferable options is the way I would try and steer that behavioral pattern. I think from what Laura was saying earlier, if you have your dreads in your sight, for example, let's ignore subcaps. If you had dreads in sight, like they get tackled, then they're probably dead because you got no friends coming, because you're on your own in a hole, and you're not maximizing the opportunity for people to come and compete against each other and have a longer fun engagement if you're not giving both sides the ability to kind of respond to what each other has brought to the fray.
Okay. Well, fair enough. I want to thank you guys all for adding you guys' opinion to this, and being as vocal as you are about it. Hopefully we see some things move along, and we'll touch base again next month and see how if wormholes have recovered at all in terms of stats and numbers. Again, thanks again for everybody showing up. Thank you to the audience for participating and listening in. This has been episode 2 of the Anoikis Connection, touch based on wormhole economics. We are going to raid somebody, so stick around. Thank you all very much for watching. Have a good night. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.